Ever since we first saw Guts cut down an apostle in cold blood amidst rubble and dead bodies, we've been asking ourselves one question. Why do apostles do what they do? Do what thou wilt is a reason that's good enough for them to believe in their own actions, but now that we're over 400 chapters into the story, we can look at things with a bird's eye view. And when we do that, we realize that the more demons profess free will to be their sole motivation, the further that seems from the truth. The reality is that even the God Hand's actions aren't free, because these 5 puppets have one puppet master pulling their strings from within the abyss, and its purpose reveals itself when you look at all of its actions out of isolation. So, in this video, we're going to attempt to break down the real purpose of the God Hand and why it spells disaster for the rest of the world. It starts with evil, the God Hand's inception and assembly. Much of this video is going to treat the infamous Chapter 83 as canon because it explains a lot of the things about the true nature and purpose of the God Hand. We'd always sort of figured that they were the agents of evil. I mean, they're involved in the ritualistic creation of demons on the regular, and the first time we see them in canon, they tried convincing a father to sacrifice his little girl and become completely inhuman. They were playing it up as if it was just the greatest thing in the world too, so guessing that the God Hand's ultimate purpose is to spread evil in the world isn't too hard. What's unclear, especially to those of you who haven't read the manga or aren't obsessed with lost chapters, is why they do it. Yes, sure, demons don't need much reason beyond craving chaos to facilitate destruction, but the God Hand is the definition of controlled chaos if they're anything. Their manipulation of the world extends back to 1,000 years ago, and their ways are subtle, with apostles being the only overt means of confirming their existence. Well, that and the Behelits. Usually, you'd have to decipher whispers from the wind, reports of pagans and heretics running sex cults dedicated to a certain flame goddess in the hills, hidden from general eyes, or an unexpected outbreak of the plague that decimates cities and can neither be explained nor contained. Nightmares of death and dreams of salvation, these are the words with which regular mortals can begin understanding the language of the God Hand if they pick up on it in the first place. Usually they don't, which is why the God Hand has gone pretty much undetected, and all the time it's been actively converting humans into their demonic thralls. So let's talk about that. Why does the God Hand need thralls in the first place? If you've seen our videos on the origins of the God Hand as well as the history of its creation, then you know why they didn't always hold sway over the 2 main worlds of Berserk. There was a time when the God Hand wasn't even a part of the astral world's ethereal structure. Before the downfall of Supreme King Geiseric's continental empire, the physical and astral worlds didn't simply overlap one another, they coexisted in a merged world where elves were found aplenty and magic wasn't perceived as being heretical. Other powerful spiritual entities like the 4 elemental kings and various daemons and elemental spirits surely existed back then, but the God Hand was birthed the day Geiseric and his kingdom died, thanks to the idea of evil. We're pretty sure the Skull King was on track for an Armageddon-style reckoning in the twilight of his reign anyway, what with him being a habitual user of the Berserker armor and all. It makes sense why the 4 kings of the world, also recorded as the 4 cardinal angels of the Holy See, would arrive at Geiseric's capital to dispense God's justice. The Skull King's hedonism apparently knew no bounds. But what actually triggered the destruction of his city and his ambition was the creation of Void, who himself was the greatest example of Geiseric's hubris. After creating his continental empire with blood and berserker rage, Geiseric attempted to rule the people of 100 different kingdoms and 1,000 different tribes, but eventually it came down to what it always comes down to with classical era civilizations, a them versus us situation. Geiseric might have started out as a war hero and a man without peer at the beginning of his reign, but since he used the berserker armor to build it and hold on to it, cracks in his conquering blade should have been expected. Guts hasn't even used the damn thing as long as he did, and he's already near blind, losing control of his motor functions, can't taste food, and succumbing to his beast of darkness with every passing moment. Even though Geiseric would have had access to a lot more resources than Guts, especially arcane ones, prolonged usage of the Berserker armor would lead to the same consequences for him. And what is the Beast of Darkness if not a manifestation of Guts' propensity for evil? At his core, Guts is a good man, we all know it. But his time as the Black Swordsman and his life experiences following the eclipse have created a thirst for blood within him that once nearly got him to kill Casca for the sake of revenge. Evil is a powerful thing, too easy to succumb to, and Gysric became the poster child for it in his later reign. When he captured Void and imprisoned him in the Tower of Conviction for speaking out against him, he solidified himself as a brutal dictator. But what really sealed his downfall was how he treated the man. Void was a sage before he became the Archangel of the God Hand. The fate of kings is highly contingent on their treatment of holy men. This is true for all religions in the world. By defiling a holy man, peeling his flesh off his face, sewing his eyes shut, exposing his mind, yet keeping him alive through malign spells and medicine, to say he needed a wake-up call would be the understatement of the century. And all that Gysric ended up doing by trying to stamp out dissent was prove that humans had the boundless capacity to commit evil acts in the name of self-preservation. We're not exactly sure who Void was before, but considering he branded everyone in Gysric City, including the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, we'd have to say they were pretty close. Gysric was known to have spent time on Elfhelm before finishing his conquest, so it could be Void was a mage from the village. The great gurus of Elfhelm are sages in essence, so the character type would fit. If this is true, then Gysric turned on a friend and treated him like that, which is truly evil. And once Void realized that the world was actually unfair, his desire to escape his torment and enact his revenge on his king surpassed that of any human before him. In the abyss of the Tower of Conviction, he became the first possessor and user of the Crimson Behelit, and thus the first God Hand. We imagine he had a conversation with the idea of evil like Griffith does in chapter 83, but theirs would have been more of a foundation course than a credit course. Void was the first human whose ego reached into the depths of the spirit world and managed to encounter a mostly theoretical existence. While his conversation with the idea of evil might have looked rather similar to the one Griffith has with it in chapter 83, unlike the rest of the God Hand, Void was the very first to go through that life-changing process. He was the first to understand that everything people thought they knew about things like destiny, fate, and so on and so forth was all lies. All of it had been predetermined by a single entity lurking deep within the abyss of the astral world. In chapter 78, after Griffith experiences his entire purpose in life from the lens that he'd originally set out to achieve it with, Void explains some things about the nature of causality to it. Before that chapter, he welcomed the apostles as the lambs of the unholy God born of man, and when Griffith showed hesitation in the face of his destiny, he was amused. Once Ubik had worked his charms and made the boy see that he'd been a stone-cold killer since day one, Void clinched the deal by telling him what would happen if he gave up on his destiny. Piling up the corpses and building a bridge to the castle of his dreams had been all that Griffith had ever done. But now, thanks to Guts, his mind was deviating from that purpose. Guts' friendship had truly changed him, and he didn't even notice it until he went insane. He saw what he would lose if he rejected the God Hand's offer, which he was still leaning towards even after taking a trip down memory lane, so Void spelled it out for him. Even after realizing that their boss had sold them out to demons to reap their blood and souls, the Band of the Falcon looked up at Griffith for direction. They still believed in him, and if he committed his wounded self to them, he could go on living as a remnant of the past. But in exchange for that, he'd have to bury everything in the ruins of his dreams, and that Void calls the cruel grace of the ungodly god born of man. His speech has the intended effect. Griffith's trigger word is dream, so when Void tells him that even if there was a slim chance that he still wanted to make it a reality, then he should sacrifice everything he loves. And he takes it. Before that happens, the Archangel explains that if it be reason that destiny transcend human intellect and make playthings of children, then it is cause and effect that a child bear his evil and confront destiny. To put that in normal terms, he basically tells Griffith that if his destiny is to become evil, then he should embrace it instead of living in the mediocrity of a powerless past. Void would know, because when he was praying to God and proclaiming all of Gysric's sins to him, he was unknowingly laying the groundwork for his own rise to power. Griffith was always teetering on the edge of brilliant and insane, but that torture broke him. He's never been a religious man, so he didn't cry out to God, but he did the next best thing. He sat there and thought about all the ways that he would kill Guts for stealing his dream. Void must have reached that same mental low point during his imprisonment, which allowed the idea of evil to influence him. In chapter 83, the idea tells Griffith that it came into existence because humans desired reasons for their suffering and deaths. They wanted everything to have meaning, so the idea was born as an agent for that, weaving people's destinies into causal webs that would come true when they accepted the evil within them as the only truth in their lives. For anyone that's been paying attention to everything that the God Hand do during an ascension ritual, they would have noticed that becoming an apostle isn't exactly as predetermined as it is choice-based. Every demon that has ever existed chose to become a demon because in their minds, doing so was escaping the pain that comes with being a human. Only a person willing to accept everything as it is can escape the cycle of causality. This slug count rejected a second chance at ascending because of his love for his daughter, which was proof of this concept in practice. But the odds of that happening again are 1 in a trillion, and Slug Count only rejected the offer the second time around. The first time he did accept, as do most who come into contact with the God Hand. In Griffith's case, Ubik and Conrad had to do some pretty jarring roleplay to convince him to join them, but once Void broke it down for him, the Fallen Falcon understood. He made the sacrifice and became the final piece of the puzzle. Since Void was the first, he received more power and thus more responsibilities. He's the only God Hand that can perform the Invocation of Doom, he has the power to manipulate space itself, and he has a better grasp on the flow of causality than any other in his peer group. The rest of the God Hand can perceive the current, but their interpretation of it only knows omniscience. Void sees it all, which means any interruptions in the God Hand's plans he allows, because he knows that it needs to happen. If Guts didn't survive the eclipse, they couldn't have triggered the incarnation ceremony. The rest of the God Hand probably had no idea they had this role to play in their future, but Void must have. He's been putting together an army of apostles and facilitating the rebirth of his kinsmen in a cycle of 216 years following his own rebirth because he needs evil to be the only ruling force in this universe. As long as humans keep believing in and communing with the good spirits of the world, that goal would remain but a dream. So, the God Hand needed to stamp out that belief to the point where humans become blind sheep that would follow whichever shepherd offered them salvation. And they did that by hijacking the most influential organized religion in the world. The prophecy of the Falcon and a future where all become one. The real purpose of the God Hand. When Void was born, so too was the God Hand's purpose of making everything fit their definition of human. You can tell that just by going back and seeing Slan's response to Griffith assaulting Casca during the eclipse. To these 5, contradictions are cause for celebration, and it's only within blood and violence that true ecstasy can be found. Over the millennium-long existence of these demon kings, they've created countless apostles that have lived and died according to their time, all for a single purpose: to make sure Griffith becomes the king of the world. See, in the aftermath of the fall of Geiseric's empire, magic started dwindling in the world of Berserk. Its influence was limited to spirit trees, and its practitioners were often shunned or hunted down for being sorcerers or witches. This makes a lot of sense when you consider that during Geiseric's time, magic and its practitioners would have been far more prevalent in the world. Judging from his interactions with Gedfring and Hanar as Skull Knight, and based on the fact that his former lover and best friend were from Skellig Island, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that Geiseric won his empire with his skills and strengths as much as he did with sorcery. He would need someone to help him navigate the pitfalls of the Berserker armor, and Lady Priestess's presence at Void's Eclipse event is proof that mages were a part of his court. If the entire world was cool with magicians during his reign, then why would they become fearful of them in its aftermath? Unless something influenced them into believing that. Time and again, we're shown that nothing in the Berserkverse is a coincidence, that it's all part of the grand design of causality. Guts' life is living proof that that isn't the case, but for a few minutes, let's just say that it is. This means that the downfall of magic and the rise of the Holy See in its aftermath was no coincidence, it was meant to be. This is mentioned ever so briefly in the manga, but after the collapse of Geiseric's capital, there was an inquisition in the region surrounding the Tower of Rebirth. Once that inquisition was complete, the tower was built, and Midland's magical past was buried, literally. The Now Kingdom adopted the new faith of the sea as its primary religious doctrine, and from that day forward, all practitioners of magic were persecuted for their powers. The world moved away from believing in spirits to fearing them, and living their entire lives under the auspices of their new, rigid, torture-friendly God. The Holy See is much like the Catholic Church, except in 2 cases. The first is that it makes torture a part of its religious belief. This might just have been Mosgus's interpretation of it, but the See is fashioned after the real-life Catholic Church, and the Middle Ages saw the Church establish its authority as brutally as it needed to. Mosgus himself was inspired by the real-life Papal Inquisitor Bernard Guy, who worked under Pope Clement V to eradicate Cathars from the realms of Christianity. Guy was particularly known for his fondness for enacting the authority bestowed upon inquisitors by a papal bull issued in 1252, which authorized torture as a means of drawing confession from heretics. Of course, this became an excuse to abuse dissidents, and to Mosgus, torturing even those who share his faith is part of his duty to God, because even minor transgressions like stealing food for one's child is tantamount to treason for him. This obsession is the first clue that the God Hand was somehow involved in the sea's creation, because Void is twisted enough to find the divinity in his torture and impart that as a religious belief onto an unsuspecting population. In order to ensure that no other spirits got in the way of their plans, the God Hand needed to suppress them, and since their powers and presence are dependent on people's beliefs in them, once that dwindled, so did their influence. Shirke once explained to a village priest that a church is a physical manifestation of the sanctuary that mages like herself would create within their minds to enable their use of magic and do things like perceive and commune with spirits. We would say that this separation of a spiritual sanctuary from a person's mind is something that the God Hand cooked up. Even if a person stops believing in magic and magical creatures, those entities don't just disappear. The collective consciousness continues to exist beyond individual thought, and so losing faith might make spirits dormant, but it won't erase them from existence. Dormancy works for the God Hand's plan though, because all they need is free reign to manipulate more humans into displacing their faith from actual spirits to a sole metaphysical entity that we're pretty sure is the idea of evil. With the rapid spread of the Holy See throughout the West, magic eventually vanished from the mainland and remained active in pockets like Elfhelm, the Kushan Empire, and Flora's Spirit Tree Mansion, where remnants of the spirit world were still active. With that accomplished, the God Hand moved on to phase 2 of their plan, which was ensuring that the savior of the universe came from their ranks. And this is where that second difference between the Catholic Church and the Church of Berserk emerges: their iconography. Catholicism's most holy symbol is the cross on which Jesus died for the sins of mankind. It's a powerful sign of repentance and reincarnation because, as the story goes, 3 days after his crucifixion, Jesus was resurrected, and a few days after that, he ascended to heaven. Any symbol that becomes associated with the very fabric of a religion is invariably tied to one of two things: its origin, or the greatest defining moment in its history. In the case of Berserk's Holy See, it's a little bit of both. The holiest icon in this religion is a falcon in flight, supported by a double helix. Now, you might be wondering why a falcon would be the religious symbol of a particularly non-animalistic religion. Well, the reason, of course, is Griffith. We should have seen this coming when Mira introduced him as the White Falcon, but now that he's triggered Fantasia and established Falconia, there can be no doubt. Even that was part of an ancient prophecy recorded in the Revelations of the Holy See, which chronicle the arrival of Femto. The prophecy of the falcon states that when the sun dies a 5th time, a red lake will appear west of the city with a name both old and new. It's a sign that the 5th angel has alighted. He is the Falcon of Darkness, the king of the blind white sheep, and the master of the sinful black sheep. He is the one who will usher in an age of darkness, and that's exactly what happens in chapter 304. Throughout the centuries, the God Hand collected its servants in the physical world and manipulated world history from the spirit world, but Griffith's rebirth was planned when the God Hand was conceived. The idea tells him as much in chapter 83, and even if you don't look at that as canon, the Sea's religious iconography is proof of it. Why else would the Pope and the rest of the Western world not even question Griffith's authenticity as the savior of mankind? The foremost idol in the sea is that of the flying falcon, and when Griffith returns to the physical world, he becomes a facsimile of the resurrected Jesus. Not many humans know exactly what went down during the eclipse, but we do. Griffith was killed and reborn as Femto on that day, with a frozen heart that signified his existence as a demon. To the general populace, he had just disappeared after being wrongfully persecuted by the Mad King, so when he was incarnated, his return felt biblical. Of course, that wasn't just because the people of the Berserkverse read their psalms, it was influenced by the God Hand down to the minute details. We'd always wondered what the reason could be behind Griffith becoming a Demon King, apart from giving his character the appropriate developmental direction. The Golden Age was a journey in discovering the humanity of Guts as much as it was a lesson on the hubris of Griffith. His desire to become a king put innocent lives at stake time and again, but when that culminated in what he did during the eclipse, calling him a demon felt true on more than just an existential level. But with the Conviction arc, the true purpose of the God Hand was revealed. Once the prophecy of the Falcon became a part of the show, everything Griffith did had to be looked at from a bigger lens, and by the time he launched his invasion, we realized his true endgame. And by extension, the God Hands, voids, and ultimately, the idea of evils. We saw that the God Hand can influence the subconscious and material worlds enough to cause rat plagues, set up pagan cults at the fringes of holy lands, and give people dreams of a false messiah. In chapter 126 through 128, we learned that most of those who called themselves faithful in the Berserk verse received a dream of a shining white falcon that would give them the salvation they so desired. We say those who called themselves faithful because this dream was mostly seen by adherents of the sea and people who truly believed that one god controlled everything in this universe. When you're hit with a triple whammy of a plague outbreak, a massive invasion, and your king dying, praying for escape from your circumstances became like oxygen, and this is something that the God Hand needed. See, the God Hand was aware of the existence of many good spirits in the world that could, in theory, match their power, so they suppressed them with the sea's doctrine of monotheism. But to truly control mankind, they needed to go beyond that, so they reshaped the meaning of God himself. They implanted Griffith's imagery 1,000 years before his birth, so that when he was incarnated, he could use it to create a kingdom where the God Hand were the only ones in control of humans. And that he does by becoming the Falcon of Light. Those prophetic dreams became associated with him even before his incarnation because of his history of saving Midland from the 100-Year War and being nicknamed the White Falcon. When Griffith met the idea of evil, he learned that none of that was a coincidence. Once he was incarnated, he used his presence and powers as a God Hand to raise an army of apostles and establish his foothold in the world by taking over Midland, considering he already had an in with its brand new queen. Him saving Charlotte was a purely tactical decision because it gave him the standing to unite all the territories that adhered to the Holy See under his leadership. And he helped things along by sending a personalized dream to the Pope himself, giving him a little longer to live so he can coronate him as the king of the new world. With the Pope's endorsement, Griffith and the Flying Falcon of the Holy See became one and the same, and he became the embodiment of the concept of the divine right of kings. As a God Hand, he was divine, but his mind was far more suited to kingship than any other human in the world. That much can't be denied, but the catch-22 here is the reason he needed to go through such an elaborate process of incarnation, conquest, and then triggering the Great Roar of the astral world, which, by the way, was the endgame as predicted by the prophecy of the Falcon. For one thing, the results speak for themselves. Every human that's not in Falconia is trying to get to Falconia, except for those who survived in the homeland of the Kushan Empire. Every human that is in Falconia literally worships him as their leader in Jesus, and that's crucial because ultimately the God Hand's goal is to ensure that evil is the only force in the universe, and for that they need all humans to become one. By isolating a large portion of humanity and putting them all under the direct influence of one of them, the God Hand now has access to what is essentially the fate of mankind. More and more people flock to this city every day, and Griffith has made plans to incorporate the entire continent of man into his futuristic empire. But his real purpose is to feed all the souls under his command to the abyss. This became clear in chapter 195 when he told Mule Wolfflame what happens to those whose spirits he communes with. As part of his game to convince people he's the real deal savior, Griffith conducts frequent funeral rites where he allows his followers to commune with the souls of their departed loved ones. By doing this, he proves to them that an afterlife exists and thus secures their loyalty unto death. But the real reason is because he sends their souls to a place where they become one. The only place where something like that can happen is within the vortex of souls, and in the very first arc of Berserk, we're told that ending up in that vortex was the fate for all of those who got caught up in the machinations of demon kind. Every apostle that was ever created, every human that was ever branded, and every person that died in anguish at the hands of an apostle, all of their souls swirl within that infernal abyss eternally, and this vortex only grows in size now that Griffith has disguised it with religious drapes. Griffith's personal goal might be to become emperor of the universe, but the God Hand's ultimate goal as a collective is to ensure the triumph of evil. That's why Griffith burnt the forest of spirit trees and took out most good wizards and witches powerful enough to reverse the damage he'd done. That's why he continues to risk lives in forays he knows he can win single-handedly. He pretends to be human when he's really a demon, and that's because the only way to make demons the supreme race is to eradicate humans altogether. If every human's life ended up within the abyss, it would make the God Hand more powerful than anyone can fathom, and ensure that evil would become the primary force in existence. The blind sheep want salvation so desperately, they ignore the naked claws of demons that are right in front of them because they think their leader is Berserk Jesus. They're in for a very rude awakening because one day, we suspect that day isn't too far off in the future, they're going to end up becoming fuel for one of his cosmic schemes. And what Griffith did to Casca the first time around will feel like a blip on the radar, all things considered. Marvelous verdict! If Guts' life experiences and Flora's interpretation of causality are correct, then clearly, choice plays a large part in the world of Berserk. But the thing with the God Hand is that it ensures you always make the choice it wants you to make. On at least a couple of occasions, we've seen people try to resist it, and once that person even succeeded. But he just ended up becoming fuel for their evils and the idea of evil itself. The idea has been spinning webs of reasons for the struggles and suffering of humans for so long that guiding them to their own extinction is not completely off the table. And considering the fact that their renewed existence would be in Berserk's version of Hell, which is where Griffith Morningstar actually resides, we can safely say that Guts will soon have more than his revenge to worry about. Putting the entire world under the direct influence of evil is the God Hand's ultimate goal, and we're afraid that they're really close to achieving it. But that's enough from us. We want to hear from you guys. Let us know your thoughts on what the God Hand's real purpose is in the comments down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one. This is Wheezy249 signing off, but you can always find me on Twitch, and until next time, don't forget, keep on struggling, strugglers.